The rain drizzled softly against the worn-out roof of the station, a slow, steady rhythm that echoed in the near-empty platform. The dim glow of the flickering lampposts barely pushed back the creeping darkness, their light reflecting in the puddles that had formed along the cracked concrete. A single wooden bench sat under the shelter, its paint peeling, its edges worn smooth by time and countless waiting passengers. But tonight, there was only one. A woman sat there, wrapped in an old coat that had once been elegant but now bore the wear of time. Her fingers clutched a small, yellowed ticket, one she had held onto for years, its edges frayed, its ink slightly faded. She didn't check the time. She didn't need to. She had been here before. Many times. Always waiting. Her eyes, hollow and distant, traced the steel rails stretching endlessly into the misty darkness. They led somewhere far away, where promises had been made and love had once flourished. But tonight, as every night before, the train station remained silent except for the occasional rustling of an abandoned newspaper caught in the wind. The cold air bit at her skin, but she did not shiver. She was numb. A distant whistle pierced through the night, and for a moment, her breath hitched. Was this the night? Was this the moment her waiting would finally end? She gripped the ticket tighter, pressing it against her chest as her heart pounded. The sound grew closer, louder, and then, it faded. Just another passing train that never stopped. Her lips trembled, but she did not cry. She had shed all her tears long ago, on a night much like this, when she had first arrived at this station with hope in her heart and love in her eyes. That hope had withered, just like the flowers she once carried, their petals long since turned to dust. Somewhere in the distance, the clock tower chimed, its solemn tone marking another hour lost to time. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, the scent of wet pavement and rust filling her senses. The memories clawed at her heart, unrelenting, whispering to her that the past could not be undone, that some people never returned, that some journeys were never completed. She let out a soft sigh, a quiet surrender to the emptiness that had become her companion. She was waiting. Always waiting. But deep down, in the depths of her broken heart, she already knew. The train she longed for was never coming. The rain had grown heavier now, each drop falling like a quiet lament against the station's iron framework. It soaked the pavement, turning the cracks into tiny rivers that ran toward the edge of the platform. The woman remained seated, her coat no longer enough to keep the cold from seeping into her bones. She did not move. She had sat through worse storms before. A gust of wind swept through the station, rustling the few remaining leaves clinging to the skeletal branches beyond the tracks. It also carried with it a memory, one that she had tried to bury, yet refused to fade. She had stood here once before, years ago, in the same rain. But back then, she had not been alone. His hand had been warm, wrapped around hers, fingers interlocked as if promising they would never let go. His voice had been steady despite the storm around them, whispering words that had carved themselves into her soul. Wait for me. 3 simple words, spoken with the confidence of a man who truly believed he would return. A promise made under the flickering station lights, sealed with a kiss against her damp forehead. He had boarded that train with one last glance, his eyes filled with 1,000 unspoken words. She had watched as the doors closed, watched as the train disappeared into the night, carrying him away to a future they had planned together. But the future had never arrived. She tightened her grip on the soaked ticket in her palm, her fingernails pressing into her skin. The years had passed, the station had aged, and yet she remained. The rain had become her companion, its touch familiar, almost comforting in its consistency. The station master walked by, glancing at her from beneath his umbrella. He had seen her before. Everyone here had. A quiet ghost among the living, a figure that never left, never moved beyond the same bench. He hesitated for a moment, as if to say something, then simply sighed and walked on. What could he say that she didn't already know? A distant clap of thunder rumbled through the sky, its echo rolling over the station. She shivered slightly but still did not move. The rain had been there that night, too. It had blurred her vision as she had read the letter that had shattered her world. A letter that had told her the train had arrived at its destination, but he had not. And so she remained, caught between the past and the present, waiting for a ghost, waiting for a promise that had turned to dust. Waiting for the train. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the cold remained, wrapping itself around her like an old, familiar embrace. The woman glanced down at the fragile piece of paper in her hands, the ticket she had carried for years, its edges worn and soft from the countless times she had run her fingers over it. It was still intact, still readable, despite all the years it had spent folded in her coat pocket. She knew every crease, every tiny smudge on its surface, yet she held it as though it were something sacred. The ink still bore his name, printed alongside hers, two souls bound by a journey that had never begun. A one-way ticket to the life they had planned, the place where they had promised to build their future. She remembered the day they bought it together. The way he had smiled, excitement flickering in his eyes as he held her hand tightly, his grip firm as if to assure her that they were real. He had laughed when she had worried about the journey, teasing her for her nervousness. "Don't overthink it, love. We'll be fine. We have each other, don't we?" And she had believed him. But the day the train departed without him, the ticket had become a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. She had kept it, thinking maybe, just maybe, he would return, that she would hear his voice calling her name, his footsteps rushing toward her through the station. That he would take her hand once more and say, "Sorry I'm late, but I'm here now." But years had passed, and he never came. And yet, she still sat here, the ticket in her hand, as if it held the power to rewind time, to bring him back, to undo the fate that had ripped him away from her. She could have left, should have left, but something inside her had always whispered, "Wait just a little longer." What if he returns? What if the train finally brings him back? The world had moved on, but she had not. Trains arrived and departed, carrying strangers to places she would never see. She watched them come and go, their faces filled with anticipation, exhaustion, joy, sorrow. And she remained in the same seat, night after night, never boarding, never leaving, never surrendering the ticket to the conductor. Because deep down, she knew the truth. This ticket wasn't meant to take her anywhere. It was all she had left of him. And if she let go of it, she feared she would lose the last piece of him she had. So she held on. Held on to the past, to the memory, to the ghost of a love that had long since vanished into the night. And still, she waited. The station's waiting hall was nearly empty, save for a few weary travelers passing through, their hurried footsteps echoing against the cold marble floor. The woman sat near the entrance, just close enough to see the platform through the rain-speckled window, yet far enough to be lost in the quiet solitude of the hall. The walls bore the weight of countless journeys, some joyful, some sorrowful. Faded posters of distant places hung askew, their edges curling from age. A rusted clock ticked on the wall, its hands moving forward, indifferent to those who wished time would stand still. She was one of them. She had spent so many nights here, in this very seat, her gaze lost in the shadows of the waiting hall. This was where they had last sat together, where they had laughed, whispered about the future, stolen moments of happiness between the ticking seconds of departure. She could still hear his voice, feel the warmth of his hand resting over hers on the armrest. "One day, we'll look back at this moment and smile," he had told her, his eyes filled with dreams. She had smiled then, believing in the promise of tomorrow. But tomorrow had never come. Now, the waiting hall was just another graveyard of memories. She turned her gaze to the far corner, where an old piano stood untouched. She had played it once, on a quiet evening much like this, her fingers moving instinctively over the keys as he had watched, a soft smile on his lips. She had always been shy about playing in public, but he had convinced her, whispering, "No one's listening but me." The tune had been their song, one they had danced to in the living room of their tiny apartment, one that had played on the gramophone the night he had asked her to wait for him. Tonight, the piano remained silent, its keys gathering dust, just like the promises they had made. A young couple sat a few rows away, whispering excitedly about their upcoming trip. The girl leaned against the boy's shoulder, their fingers intertwined, their love untouched by time's cruel hand. She watched them, a faint smile ghosting her lips before fading into something more hollow. She remembered what it was like to love so freely, to dream so fearlessly. But love, she had learned, was not always enough. A deep sigh escaped her lips as she reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the old, folded letter, the one that had arrived in place of him. She didn't need to read it. She had memorized every word, every cruel confirmation that the man she had loved would never step onto this platform again. Yet, she remained. Because memories, however painful, were all she had left. And so she sat, lost in the ghosts of the past, waiting in a hall that no longer waited for anyone. The night was colder now, the station bathed in the dim glow of flickering lamps. The woman sat motionless, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of the old letter. It was worn and fragile, much like her heart, held together only by the force of memories she refused to let slip away. She had read the letter countless times, yet each time felt like a fresh wound reopening. The ink had faded, but the words remained sharp, cutting through her like shards of glass. We regret to inform you that Private James Whittaker has been declared missing in action. Despite our best efforts, we have been unable to locate him. We extend our deepest condolences. Condolences. A word so empty, so meaningless in the face of what she had lost. They had written those words as if they could erase his existence, as if a simple letter could replace the warmth of his embrace, the laughter they had shared, the dreams they had woven together. But she had refused to accept it. Missing was not the same as gone. He had promised her he would return. He had looked into her eyes and sworn that he would come back for her, that their journey together was only beginning. And James had never been a man to break his promises. So she had waited. The first year had been the hardest. Every train that pulled into the station had sent her heart racing, every uniformed soldier stepping onto the platform had made her breath hitch. She had scanned every face, searching for his familiar smile, for the glint in his eyes that could never be mistaken. But he had never come. Still, she had stayed. Others had told her to move on, that life was not meant to be spent waiting for ghosts. They didn't understand. They hadn't heard his voice the way she had, hadn't felt the weight of his words, hadn't seen the certainty in his gaze when he had whispered, "No matter what happens, I will come back to you." The years had worn her down, but they had not stolen her hope. Even now, after all this time, she could not bring herself to believe that he was truly gone. A gust of wind blew through the open doors of the station, rustling the letter in her hands. She clenched it tightly, as if holding onto it could somehow keep him close. Had he been afraid in his final moments? Had he called out for her, reaching for a promise he could no longer keep? Or had he fought to return, to make his way back to her, only to be swallowed by a fate beyond his control? The thought made her chest tighten, her breath shaky as she wiped a tear from her cheek. She had given him her heart, her trust, her future. And in return, he had given her a promise. A promise that had never been kept. And yet, she still waited. Because love was not about logic. It was about faith. And she still had faith in the man who had once sworn to return to her. Even if the world had long since given up on him. The station had always been a place of movement, of fleeting moments where lives intersected for mere seconds before vanishing into the distance. But for her, it was a place frozen in time, a mausoleum of memories that whispered to her in the quiet hours of the night. She had watched countless farewells unfold before her eyes. Lovers clinging to each other as if time could be slowed by the force of their embrace. Parents waving as their children departed, their eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Friends laughing through their goodbyes, unaware that some of them would never see each other again. And then there were the soldiers. She remembered the first time she had stood on this platform, her fingers wrapped around James's sleeve, unwilling to let go. The war had called for him, but she had been too young, too in love, to understand the depth of what that meant. "I'll be back before you know it," he had said, brushing his lips against her forehead. "Don't say goodbye, love. Just wait for me." So she had waited. But as the years passed, she had begun to see the truth in the faces of those left behind. The ones who had stood where she now sat, holding on to hope until it withered in their hands. She had seen the way their expressions changed, how love and longing turned into quiet acceptance, how their eyes stopped searching the crowd, how one day, they simply stopped coming at all. She had never joined them. Every night, she returned to this place, watching ghosts board trains that no longer existed. The echoes of old departures haunted her, playing out before her like a cruel trick of time. She could still see the boy who had promised his mother he would write, the young woman who had sworn to wait just like she had, the man who had waved with confidence, unaware he would never return. She wondered how many others had sat where she now sat, holding on to the past with trembling hands. How many letters had been read and reread, how many names had been whispered into the night with the hope that saying them aloud would make them real again. The ghosts never spoke to her, but their presence was enough. They reminded her that she was not alone in her sorrow, that the pain of waiting was one carried by many before her. Still, the question gnawed at her, was she waiting for him, or was she waiting to become one of them? A gust of wind swept through the station, rustling her coat as a train pulled in, its brakes hissing like a sigh. She didn't look up. She already knew he wouldn't be on it. Just like he hadn't been on any of the others. And yet, she remained. Because leaving meant admitting he was gone. And she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The sound of the station intercom crackled to life, a voice spilling through the static and into the stillness of the waiting hall. It was a voice that had become a part of her routine, the voice that had delivered announcements of arrivals and departures, each one like a slap against her quiet hope. But this time, it was different. She had heard it before, that subtle shift in the tone, the slight hesitation that marked an announcement made not by the conductor but by something much more final. A voice that spoke of things no one wished to hear. "Attention, please. The 11:45 train from New Haven has arrived. This will be the final call for all passengers. Please ensure all belongings are with you before disembarking." It was as though the entire world paused for a moment, the air thick with a feeling that something had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Her grip tightened on the ticket in her hands, her knuckles white against the fading paper. She didn't need to look up. She had known for a while now that this moment would come, but she had never prepared herself for it. The final train. The words lingered in her mind like an echo that refused to fade. She had been waiting for so long that the idea of departure, of an end, seemed impossible. How could she let go now, when she had spent her whole life keeping the flame of his promise alive? How could she accept that he would never return, that the last train had come and gone without him? A bitter laugh escaped her lips, the sound strange and hollow in the silence of the station. She had known this moment would arrive, yet part of her had clung to the hope that it wouldn't. That the endless waiting would stretch into forever. That the train would keep coming, carrying him home just one more time. But the final call echoed once more through the intercom, its words cutting through her heart like a knife. Last call for the 11:45 train. Please make your way to the platform. She stood slowly, her legs stiff, her body feeling as though it had forgotten how to move. She had never imagined the finality of it all, the sense of closure that she had avoided for so long, the feeling of being left behind while the world carried on. She walked to the edge of the platform, her eyes scanning the crowd, knowing that the face she was searching for would never appear. Yet, her feet moved mechanically, as though some unseen force was guiding her. The train was already there, waiting, its doors open, the promise of departure clear in the hiss of its brakes. But she didn't board. Instead, she stepped back, her eyes filling with tears as she whispered the only thing she could. "Goodbye, James." The final call had been made, and with it, she knew she could no longer wait. She could no longer live in the shadows of what could have been. It was time to let go. The woman stood at the edge of the platform, staring at the train that had now begun to pull away. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks seemed to echo in her heart, a constant reminder of the journey that had been promised but never realized. She had waited for this moment her entire life. Every day, every minute, every second, had been an extension of that promise, the promise that one day, he would return to her, that the two of them would leave together, embarking on a life they had only dreamed of. But now, the tracks stretched out before her, empty, barren, just like the future she was left with. The train had left. And with it, the last of her hope. For years, she had pictured this moment over and over in her mind. She had imagined him stepping off the train, his eyes searching for her in the crowd, his smile lighting up the darkness like a beacon. She had imagined the way his arms would feel around her once more, the way his voice would sound as he whispered promises of tomorrow. But now, there was nothing. The empty platform seemed to stretch on forever, a place that had once been filled with the potential of their love, now a symbol of everything she had lost. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing the tears to stop. She had cried enough for 1,000 lifetimes. But the sorrow was a weight she could not shake, an ache deep in her chest that no amount of time could heal. She had spent so long imagining a future with him, planning their life together, that she had never considered the possibility of his absence. How could she have? He had been her everything. Her hope. Her heart. The man who had promised to return to her, to take her away from this lonely existence. But now, the journey that was supposed to begin with him would never be taken. And she was left to navigate a world without him. For the first time, she felt the crushing reality of it. He wasn't coming back. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Her heart twisted in her chest as she slowly turned away from the tracks, her feet dragging as she made her way back to the waiting hall. The station was now quieter, the hustle and bustle of the day having faded into the soft murmur of silence. She walked past the old piano, its keys still dusty, its music never to be played again. She had spent so many years waiting for him, believing that one day, he would walk through those doors, that the station would once again be filled with their laughter, their love. But it never happened. And now, she had to let go. Her journey had never begun. And it was time to accept that it never would. As she left the station, she took one final look over her shoulder, her heart heavy with the weight of all the years she had spent waiting for a future that would never be. Goodbye, James. And with that whispered farewell, she stepped into the world, her journey now one of healing, of learning how to live without him, and of finding peace in the quiet spaces between the past and the future. The journey that was meant to begin never would. But she had to start again, alone, with nothing but the memories of a love that was. The bench was the same as it had always been, its worn wood weathered by the countless years it had stood in the station. A place where people came and went, sitting for moments that would forever be lost to time. Yet to her, it was no ordinary bench. It was where they had shared their first kiss, their hands clasped together as the train pulled out of the station, signaling the start of their journey. It was where they had laughed about the mundane, their love growing with each passing minute, the world beyond them nothing more than a distant memory. And now, it was where she sat alone. The bench, once a symbol of hope and new beginnings, had become a silent witness to the passage of time, to the years that had slipped away like sand through her fingers. She ran her hand over the smooth surface, tracing the grooves that had once been so familiar to her, and it felt like touching a ghost. The memory of him lingered in the air, faint yet ever present, as if he had never truly left. But the space beside her remained empty. The station was quieter now, the usual bustle of activity muted by the heavy silence that had settled around her. The trains no longer passed by with the same sense of urgency. The hum of conversations and the shuffle of feet had faded into the background, leaving only the sound of her own breath and the soft rustle of leaves from the trees outside the station. She closed her eyes and let herself drift back to the past, back to the days when their lives had been filled with promise. She could almost hear his voice calling her name, the warmth of his smile, the way he had always known just what to say to make her feel seen, understood, and loved. But all of it was gone now. The fading echoes of their love played out in her mind like a song on a broken record, repeating and repeating, but always slipping away before it could reach the end. She could feel the weight of the years pressing down on her chest, and yet, there was no relief in sight. The bench creaked softly under her, a quiet reminder of the passing of time. The echoes of laughter that had once filled the space between them were now silent, leaving only the soft hum of the wind to fill the void. She stood up, her legs shaky, and for a moment, she thought she could hear him whisper her name, just on the edge of hearing. She turned, her heart racing, but there was nothing. No one. The empty bench stared back at her, its silence as loud as the absence that had grown within her. She could almost feel the pull of the past, the weight of all the moments they had shared, urging her to stay, to remember. But she knew she had to let go. With one last glance, she turned and walked away, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the station. The bench remained behind her, empty once more, as the fading echoes of a love that was never meant to be anything more than a memory slowly drifted into the distance. And she kept walking, carrying the weight of her own heart, the empty space beside her a reminder of everything she had lost. The hours passed, and the station slowly began to empty, the last of the evening crowd fading away into the shadows. The lights above flickered softly, casting a dull glow across the now quiet platform. She remained in her place, her eyes fixed on the tracks, though she no longer knew what she was looking for. The train had never come. The truth of it settled in her bones, slow and heavy, like the cold night air that crept beneath her coat. She had spent so many years waiting for it, for the moment when the wheels would scream against the metal tracks, when the train would pull in and he would step off, his smile lighting up the darkness. The promise of his return had always been the heartbeat of her existence. But tonight, as the final trains departed, the reality she had been avoiding hit her with an unforgiving force. She could feel the weight of it now, the way it pressed against her chest, each breath a little harder than the last. She had waited too long for something that would never happen. Her heart, once filled with the warmth of anticipation, now ached with the cold emptiness of loss. She glanced at the empty platform, imagining the train pulling into the station. But the tracks remained still, untouched by the wheels that would never roll again, untouched by the hope that had kept her tethered to this place for so long. She stood, her legs trembling beneath her, as if the very ground had lost its solidity. Slowly, she took a step forward, her gaze still on the tracks, as though the train might still appear if she waited just a little longer. She stood there, in the silence, waiting for the sound of the train's arrival that would never come. Minutes stretched into hours. Her eyes blurred with tears, and she closed them briefly, as if to block out the overwhelming sense of finality that threatened to swallow her whole. She had been waiting for a love that had already passed her by, for a promise that had been broken long ago. But she couldn't accept it. Not yet. The cold wind swept through the station, and she shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She looked around one last time, the empty platform reflecting the emptiness that had overtaken her. There was no one here. No one left to come. No train to take her anywhere but further into the past. With a final, sorrowful glance at the tracks, she turned to leave. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to step away from the waiting, from the hope that had clung to her like a shadow. It wasn't the ending she had imagined. But it was the one she needed. The train that never came had taken her heart with it, but in the quiet of the station, she realized something else: she was still standing. She was still alive. And perhaps, that was the only journey she could begin now.